Alright, class, welcome to chapter 1 and 2, which is going to be lesson 1. We cover chapter 1 relatively quickly because it's a preview chapter, and so this will let us know what we're going to get into going forward. However, that being said, it's going to have a lot of material that's duplicitous in terms of what we're going to cover in the chapters that are to follow. Chapter 2 is where we really start to delve into, for the first time, some of the meaty material of the book, but both of them combined are going to give us an important preview as to what we're learning about. So, in the introduction, one of the things that we're going to be able to talk about are some of the virtues and drawbacks of organizational activity. We're going to talk about the curse of cluelessness, strategies for improving organization. We're going to talk about framing and why the framed perspective that the book puts forward is so important. And we're going to talk a little bit about multi-frame thinking. But let's get first to the virtues and drawbacks of an organization. First and foremost is that organizations are large, complex, and they're historically recent. Large organizations, as we understand them, did not exist for literally hundreds of years. The way that you think of globalization, and globalization has been a word that's almost become ubiquitous over the generation, and what we think of as globalization is that the world is getting smaller and that we're able to ship packages to and fro and that we're able to do business across continents. And intercontinental business and organizations that are able to accommodate it are relatively new entities. When you think about complex, gigantic transnational corporations and organizations, they're a relatively new phenomenon. So studying them is important to not only understanding where the future of business is going, but also how these organizations came to being from a historical perspective hopefully gives you at least some leaning into the decision-making process that made them get as large and complex as they are. And most importantly, out of everything, why do they need to be so complex? What parts of them are important, what parts are not, and how do all these different moving pieces fit together? Much of society's work is actually done in or by organizations. When you think about the things that are around you right now, if you're sitting in front of a computer, that computer has microchips that were formatted in one place or another, put together, and then information was loaded probably in California's Silicon Valley. You're talking about a computer that was then assembled and put together in a relatively low-cost manufacturing area. Might be China, might be Japan, might be Hong Kong, but you can check the maker of your computer or your laptop and you're going to be able to find that that's probably where it was put together because it was easiest to do there. Right now, if you're listening to this through speakers, the actual subwoofers and pieces of the speakers are not all from the same place. They were gathered from around the world in different places of manufacture. Where are your shoes from that you're wearing? I'm assuming you're not listening to this naked, but I guess that's the joy of an online class. You can adapt to it however you'd like. If you're wearing clothing right now, though, the textiles and materials that make those clothing come from different places. They're put together in factories that have acquired those textiles in order to put them together in order to make the clothes that you're wearing. Simply put, organizations do the stuff that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. What does that mean, though? It means that they produce typically poor service, defective, or dangerous products. This happens because whenever you're mass producing things for a large scale environment and there's a lot of different complex pieces to an organization, things can fall apart. Things can get really hairy really fast, and if one person down an assembly line makes a mistake, then everything starts to fall apart. There have been a lot of examples that you can point to, but I think some in the news that are relatively easy to draw and harken back to are the idea that there's been lead paint in toys for children that were produced in Chinese industrial entities. These toys were sent out and kids got exposed to lead-based paint. Why? Because the factory made a mistake. It wasn't because they were trying to poison children. It's because they're so big that somebody made a mistake somewhere along the supply line and you ended up getting a defective good. How many times have you purchased something that you got either from Amazon or you got from Newegg or you got from Tiger Direct, and it was an electronic good of some sort that you bought sight unseen and it arrived DOA or dead on arrival? It's every time you plug in something and it doesn't work the way that it was supposed to work in the first place. Things come out defective, and companies and organizations that can overcome this thrive in certain markets, and others, it's just expected that some of them are going to be flawed. If you buy 100 external hard drives and anywhere between 80 and 85% of them work, you're very satisfied because about 15% of all external hard drives fail. They fail within the first 3 months. They can't read the data. Simply put, they are badly made. They're defective. However, when you're talking about Apple computers, they charge you a little something extra to get a MacBook, but that's typically because their quality control is very high. You don't get a lot of Apple products that are defective coming out of the lot. That's not to say that they're necessarily good products or they're better products, but they've started to recognize that defects that are brought forward through the manufacturing process are reasons for a consumer not to interact with you. These organizations, as they're getting more complex, are getting more nuanced in the way that they interact with you, the potential consumer. And here's the sad thing, is what happens whenever you're talking about an international or transnational corporation? It's really easy to exploit people, the communities around them, to damage the environment. I just talked about Apple, and sometimes I'm going to pick on Apple and sometimes I'm going to champion Apple's cause. Apple uses sweatshop labor in order to mass produce electronics. If you research right now and you search into a Google menu and you type in Apple workers trying to commit suicide, they have one of the most horrific stories that you're going to find. They're called suicide nets. These nets are hung outside of the industries in which they actually make the components for Apple products. So many people have literally decided that their life is so meaningless and sad and awful, and the conditions in these sweatshop locations are so terrible that they're going to jump out a window and try to end their own life. They're caught by a net, they're retrieved, they're spoken to, and they're taken right back to their job. That's exploitation at its absolute worst. But you want the brand new iPhone. You want a brand new MacBook every year. The way that these organizations exploit people is that someone suffers unimaginably in a place far, far away that you don't have to see or think about or interact with, and you just get the new and latest good so that you can leave a mean tweet while you're in your bedroom. And that's how exploitation really occurs. They take advantage of communities and they damage the environment. When you're talking about a large organization, sometimes you're talking about something that's literally changing hands with millions, hundreds of millions, or potentially billions of dollars in a fiscal year. If you're talking about an organization that big, it might just be cheaper for them to damage the environment and let it go. When you think about what happened in Flint, Michigan, and poisoning lead into the water, how did that happen? Well, it happened because pollutants were pumped into aquifers and the water was allowed to be vetted into the river. And so there's more and more times whenever you can understand how damaging the environment takes place from the complexity, largeness, and grandness of organizations that are in our very lives. They have virtues. It's necessary to get those shoes, to get this computer, and to get this microphone working, and the speakers that you're listening to it through. But they also exploit people. They damage communities, and they make people who otherwise wouldn't have really horrible lives. So it's something to think about the positives and negatives about an organization. It's a starting point for our discussion. The sad thing is true, too, that the larger an organization gets, the more clueless that it seems. We've all interacted with bad managers. You can think about in your own life the amount of times that bad management has produced something negative for you. If we were in a classroom setting, I would ask the question, how many of you have ever faced a bad manager? And most of the people who have had gainful employment will raise their hand. Why do bad managers happen? Well, it happens for a lot of different reasons. Maybe it's nepotism, which is you were hired because you are a boss's relative of some sort. But let's face it, the bygone product of networking or who you know hiring is that it's not merit-based. And when you get off a merit-based, meritocracy-based system and you hire somebody because they know somebody within the company or they've got a friend, a second question I'd gladly ask to a classroom that was in front of me is, how many people do you know who got their job because they had a friend who worked there? And a lot of hands go up for these things. And it's not because those businesses or those people are evil or bad in any way, shape, or form. It's just because that's the way that networking works. You get a job through somebody, and that can produce massive ineptitude. There's a study that said that 50 to 75% of American managers are incompetent. Now, realize that observation bias in these studies is one thing to denote, but the way that they decided incompetence was either one of two things. One, they were producing beneath their goals, or two, people who were being surveyed, the actual workers, found that they did a really poor job in terms of making sure that the human capital, the people that worked in these organizations, were doing the maximum amount that they could. A lot of things that you try to do in a big corporation or a big organization fail. Not because the idea is bad, but because it's really hard to be able to influence something that goes across national borders, and it's the plight of the small business. If you imagine yourself in Arkansas building widgets, and so there becomes a demand large enough to make that widget factory grow into an entire statewide organization. It moves out of your basement, it moves out of the small chamber in which you held in Benton, Arkansas, and it grows up, and now you have to move maybe to a couple of facilities in Little Rock and Benton and Bauxite in different places, and then later you start to move and say, I'm going to be a national corporation. I'm not only going to have my headquarters in Little Rock, but I'm also going to start to move to the west and have someplace in California, and I'm going to move to the greater Northeast, and I'm going to expand the market maybe in New York. I hit these hubs, and then as I do that, it gets harder and harder to control the organization because I don't have the same hand-eye touch tactile feel that I had in the first place of interacting with these organizations. Larger and more complex entities are more difficult to manage, and initiatives that you put forth seem to make you seem clueless because they're ineffective. But the truth is, it's hard work. The sad thing about running a big corporation is that everyone wants to be paid CEO money, but CEO money comes with CEO responsibilities. And it's difficult to be able to manage something that is so grand in its scale. However, don't be too abysmal, don't be too sad, don't be too down. There's strategies to improve organizations. We can look at better management, consultation, and government policy and regulation. So let's talk first about better management. You can get smarter, more equipped people that might not have known the right people but are just darn good at their job. That's whenever you're looking at a resume and you're thinking about the qualifications that that person brings to the table. You can get consulting. It's really easy for everybody in an organization because they want it to succeed to tell the people who are in management they're doing a good job because they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to get into any trouble. However, consultation from a third party or an outside source that's hired directly to be honest with you can do a lot in order to help you get better results from your management process. And then there's government policy and regulation. Let's talk back about those Chinese factories, and I'm picking on them a little bit. It happens in most industrial mass production entities, but we're talking about China for the sake of the example. Government policies that prevent people from working too often, prevent exploitation. So the fact that there's an hourly limit, the fact that there's a minimum wage. What a minimum wage always says, and you should reflect on this because I've thought about it, I've worked many minimum wage jobs, is you're doing a job that society has decided they will pay you the least amount possible because they don't value that particular job. But a government regulation or policy is what keeps that from being pennies on the dollar. It's so that you can make some kind of living or earned wage to try to support yourself. Excuse me. So when we're talking about government policies and regulations, they might be in order to keep the environmental degradation to a minimum. They might be able to prevent the exploitation of people and things. But ultimately, those are ways to improve organizations and the ways that they make people work. So what's a frame? I want to give you an analogy of a frame that extends this idea as a frame as a window. If you take your fingers and you make two L's and you put them together so that they make a little rectangle, you're going to be able to see some things out of it and not other things. If you're looking through a telescope, for example, you see projected into your eye those things that the telescope is pointed towards. If you're looking through binoculars, you can see at a greater distance, but you can only see that to which those binoculars are pointed at. If you've ever been at a zoo and they have those stationed binoculars that are festooned to the ground in some way, they literally can't move on a 360-degree angle. So if there's ever something that's just outside the sight line of those binoculars, that's what this frame analysis does, is it sets boundaries around that to which we're discussing. It highlights certain things that organizations are doing well, and it also highlights those things that they're not doing well. The frame is a tool. If I could tell you anything about the way that this particular book approaches organizations, it's that I choose this book for a specific reason. I think that it's a valuable method of understanding organizations that's useful, that's practical. It's a tool. Communication studies often gets lumped into, oh, you study communication. What does that really mean? I always think that it creates you a linguistic and terminological tool set that lets you interact with the world around you, lets you describe things better, lets you understand things better. I think the world is born in communication and expressed in communication, and the true possibilities of what human interaction can be is based in communication. So these frames that we're going to look at, 4 in total, are going to give you different methods of looking at the same organization that would highlight different things. So I'm going to let you learn about the blink process as you read through the book. I want to talk about the frames themselves. The structural frame is one of 4 frames that literally comes from the idea of physical, of dealing with that to which the way that an organization is organized, put together. So structure literally as though building, as though foundation, as though A links to B, links to C. If you played with Legos, Lincoln Logs, an erector set, you understand the metaphor of the structural nature of an organization. Its roots come from sociology. We want to better understand how the way that things fit together create a unified whole, or they don't. And they have some managerial science. Can a top-down or a bottom-up organization function better? The key concepts that you deal with structural frames are really roles and goals. When I'm talking about roles and goals, it's who does what thing, how do they interact, and how do those different things that the people are doing create a pathway to achieving goals. If I am putting the tires on an automobile and it's going down the assembly line and you're driving in the lug nuts, and then the next person down the line is putting on the hubcaps, we're all working on a moving assembly line to the creation of a car. The moving assembly line is a perfect analogy for the structural frame because it shows how an organization or group comes together with all different people doing micro pieces of a larger whole that everyone can interact with. It's about formalized relationships. I put the lug nuts on. I put the hubcaps on. We each have a job, a role, something that we can interact with towards the end goal, the thing that we're all working towards. There's an alignment of structure with goals and environment, and that's how you decide whether an organization is high functioning or low functioning within the structural frame. Now, complete alternative, the second of the 4 frames, is the human resources frame. Its roots come from personality, social psychology, and the idea that some people are just better fit for some jobs than others. It deals a lot more with needs and feelings. You'll notice that in a structural perspective, your needs and your feelings don't necessarily matter to the way that it's structured. If I'm the lug nut guy, then I could be talented at any number of things, but they could put a different person in to complete the lug nut task, and they look at the structure, the piece of the job, rather than the individual. The human resources frame, by contrast, looks at Becky and John, and what Becky and John's specific abilities are, what their needs are, what their skills are, how they feel about the organization, and it puts them in the best place to try to succeed. I like to use the human resources frame in a sporting analogy, and that is if you were putting together a team, either baseball, football, basketball, any sport that you can imagine, no matter the gender, whether it was a women's team or a men's team, there's a certain set of characteristics and skills that you need out of certain positions. You might think of a basketball team and say that I need a center who is capable of playing in the low post in order to score from there and play defense. I'm going to need somebody who's going to be able to play point guard who can handle the ball well and be fast. These are skills. The human resources frame goes beyond just the skills that this person brings to the table to say, what kind of attitudes do you have? Do you have somebody on your team who's a team leader, who's motivational, who's the one who is uplifting, who brings people together? Do you have somebody that someone else can rally behind? These are the skills that are highlighted in a human resources frame, and so the central focus becomes the fit between the individual and the organization and the role that they're being asked to play to see whether the strength or weakness of an organization. If you look at the political frame, it obviously takes its footing from political science. It's one of my favorites. I like politics. I teach political discourse. My PhD is in rhetoric. I'm interested in how political speeches rally and move people to one cause or another. It deals with one of my favorite words, and that's power. It deals with how interest, conflict, influence power, and you get scarce resources. We all want to make more money. We all want more power within our organization. We all want to move upward. If you have any ambition whatsoever towards power, the political frame is for you. It tries to analyze an organization to make sure that it is properly attributing some amount of power or empowering to the individuals that are in that organization to try to make the most of what they get, to try to have productive conflict, to try to have people who want to achieve and want to succeed have that opportunity to do so. It also lets conflict be a method of getting things done. If you set rivals towards the same goal, sometimes you really get some amazing things. And that's what the political frame really highlights about organizations. The symbolic frame has its entire root in cultural anthropology and social scientific research that says that symbols matter. I think that semiotics is another method of understanding the symbolic frame. It's where culture, myth, ritual, and story come together to start to give you a backbone for how to understand an organization. The foundational story of Ray Kroc is as important to what McDonald's is all about as is the Golden Arches themselves. They're a symbol of what you think of whenever you think about that particular organization. Some organizations are literally synonymous with that to which they produce. If I asked you what a cotton swab was, you'd probably call it a Q-tip. Well, that's a particular brand that has become synonymous with that particular good. If I asked you to pass me a tissue, you might hand me and say, here's a Kleenex. That's a brand that's become literally symbolic of the specific corporation, organization, product that they have. So the central focus that we'll deal with when we deal with the symbolic frame is how they built that culture, how they stage that organizational drama, and how they make sense of the symbolic frame around them. I like this particular slide, and I think that it's important because it helps you compare the structural human resource frame, and then the next one, obviously, I'll go back and forth here, the political and symbolic frames. The metaphors for each of them make a lot of sense. Factory, family, jungle, or carnival. So what I mean by a factory is, how do the different pieces of a factory fit together? That moving assembly line analogy again springs to mind. But a machine, how do the different cogs in the machine make that machine run? A human resource frame might think of it as a family. It's how do each of the individuals work with one another? How do their relationships mean that they succeed? Why do we care for one another, and why do we care about the family writ large and as a whole? And it also highlights some of the central concepts that surround these particular frames. Extending to the political frame and the symbolic frame, we're using the metaphor of the jungle for politics. You have to exist in a dangerous environment one with a lot of different creatures, a lot of different threats, and you have to be able to thrive in that kind of environment. And the symbolic is the carnival, the theater, the showmanship of an organization that makes it clear that through symbolism you draw people in. It creates culture through that to which is seen and unseen, that to which is clear and unclear, that to which is described and left to thought. So, again, the last thing that I'm going to scroll through for these two is that the image of leadership from a structural perspective is social architecture. I can put the right people in the right place to succeed. Human resources, I can put people in a place where they'll grow and will thrive as an organization. For the political frame, it's that I'm going to be able to put an advocate or a leader who is able to be transformative in a position to succeed. And the symbolic, I'm going to inspire people to be a part of this organization in a manner that is meaningful to them. I'm going to cut this short, actually, and I'll just split up the two chapters. I thought that lesson 1 would be chapter 1 and 2, but as is often the case when I get on my soapbox and I get rolling, sometimes the words come in great volume, and so I am going to go ahead and split these chapters because I had a lot more to say about chapter 1 than I thought I would. I hope you've enjoyed chapter 1. If you have any questions, let me know. And in terms of a response paper, I think you could talk about comparing some of the frames at the very quick and fast, dirty level that we compared them. What you think some of them might be. What's your favorite of the potential frames that we're going to talk about? How are complex organizations a part of your life? How are simplistic organizations a part of your life? There's a great many responses that I believe that you could make based on this chapter, but those are some of the ones that spring off the top of my head. And if you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to contact me via email, and I hope you have a lovely end to your day.